Lisa Sue. Hi there, Lisa. AMD's releasing a new graphics card. Great, that will really help. It's only as fast as the RX 480. Well, I suppose it'll be able to play the latest games at max settings, right? Not with a 4 gigabytes of VRAM in 2022. Gosh, well, I'm sure there'll be ways around that. We can work 64-bit memory interface. Gosh, that's quite narrow, isn't it? Well, as long as there's 16 lanes of PCIe for just 4 PCIe lanes, and no H.264 or H.265 video encoding. Alright guys, Dominic here for Kit Guru, and yes, that's right, we are looking at the RX 6500 XT. This is AMD's latest GPU designed to offer a solid gaming experience at 1080p with a supposed MSRP of $199 or £180 here in the UK. As you have probably worked out though from that introduction and just my general tone about this review, I really think this is a terrible graphics card and I do not think you should buy it at all. So this video is basically me just explaining my reasoning behind that and why I think you should completely avoid the 6500 XT. For me, the first alarm bell started ringing when AMD announced the core spec of this new GPU. Using the new Navi 24 silicon, it's basically Navi 23 cut in half. That means we have just 16 compute units and 1024 stream processors, alongside 16 ray accelerators and 32 ROPs. My disappointment was honestly immediate though when I saw just 4 gigabytes of VRAM alongside a paltry 64-bit bus, giving total memory bandwidth of 144 gigabytes a second. Now AMD does also provide 16 megabytes of its Infinity Cache, which it claims will boost the effective memory bandwidth, but we will have to see about that. The only real interesting points include the switch to a 6nm process, as well as super high clock speeds with the boost well over 2800 MHz, despite total board power coming in at just over 100 watts. One key spec not shown in that table, however, is the fact that the 6500 XT uses a PCIe 4.0 by 4 interface, so it's got just 4 PCIe lanes. Now I am testing on a PCIe 4.0 platform, so I can test with the full bandwidth, but a really interesting area to look at is going to be what performance is going to be like on a PCIe 3.0 platform. We've already seen AMD release a few other GPUs with reduced interfaces, such as the 5500 XT, the 6600 XT, and the 6600, but those were all by 8 interfaces, so they had 8 PCIe lanes, whereas the 6500 XT has just 4. With that in mind, for all of our games testing today, you are going to see 2 entries for the 6500 XT, one tested with PCIe 4.0 and one with PCIe 3.0. That's because I think the vast majority of people who are going to be looking at a GPU of this class will more than likely be still on a PCIe 3.0 platform, so that difference between the two really is going to be crucial. As for the rest of our test setup then, we're using a new test system provided to us by Cyberpower. It's using Intel's latest i9-12900K CPU, as well as an MSI Z690 carbon Wi-Fi motherboard. That's paired with 32GB of Corsair Dominator Platinum DDR5 memory clocked at 5200 MHz, with all the games installed on a 2TB Seagate FireCuda 530 SSD. All of our testing was done fresh over the last week using the latest drivers, so we used the 511.23 driver for NVIDIA GPUs and the 22.1.1 driver for AMD GPUs. AMD also provided us with a press driver for the 6500 XT, and another thing to note is we are testing with resizable bar enabled for all supported GPUs. So with all of that out the way then, it's time to roll the benchmarks. Straight away, it is a pretty poor start for the 6500 XT in Assassin's Creed Valhalla. Performance is basically identical to an RX 580, and it's actually slower than the GTX 1060, delivering 43 FPS on average. However, it gets even worse, as dropping down to PCIe 3.0 delivers a hammer blow for the 6500 XT, as the frame rate drops to just 31 FPS on average, making it slower than even the lowly GTX 1650. Unfortunately, Cyberpunk 2077 shows us the exact same thing. Performance is really no better than a GTX 1060, and it's actually 13% worse than the 5500 XT 4GB, a GPU which launched at £160 over 2 years ago. And then when we test at PCIe 3, you can knock off another 25% of the 6500 XT's performance for a lovely 24 FPS experience. Death Stranding is next, and the average frame rate here is actually not dreadful. It's no better than the RX 580, however, which is a big disappointment. We can see significantly reduced 1% low performance, however, though this was also the case for the 4GB RX 5500 XT, which makes me think it's likely a memory bandwidth issue for both of those cards. Cutting PCIe bandwidth to Gen 3 here isn't as bad as the first two games, but the 1% lows are still poor, and the average frame rate is down by 8%. Next up is Far Cry 6, and would you believe it, the 6500 XT is actually faster than the RX 580 here, delivering about 55 FPS on average. Unfortunately, it's no better than the 5500 XT, however, and actually, when we do test with PCIe 3.0 speeds, performance is back at RX 580 levels. Great progress, AMD. As for Forza Horizon 5, this game perfectly illustrates the fundamental flaws of the 6500 XT. We know it is a very VRAM hungry title, but if you look, the 4GB 5500 XT is still delivering solid performance at these settings. In what's likely a combination of the 4 PCIe lanes and the incredibly limited memory bandwidth, however, the 6500 XT performance drops off a cliff, and then it drops off another one when we test with PCIe 3. Of the 12 games we tested though, the 6500 XT does best, and by quite a long way, in Hitman 3. For starters, we see basically no difference between PCIe 3 or 4 in this title, and the 6500 XT is not far at all from matching the 1660 Super. Then again, it is still only 8% faster than the 5500 XT 4GB, but hey, at least we're getting a playable experience here, right? Moving on to Horizon Zero Dawn, here the 6500 XT is matching the 1650 Super and the 5500 XT 8GB, making it just a handful of frames faster than the GTX 1060 and RX 580. That is, until of course we test with PCIe 3.0, at which point it delivers the same average frame rate as the RX 570, but with significantly worse 1% lows, at which point, to be honest, I'd rather just have a GTX 1650. Guardians of the Galaxy is another game where, perhaps surprisingly, the 6500 XT does okay. I mean, even at its best with PCIe 4.0, it's no faster than the 1650 Super, so we're not exactly talking about great performance, but it is still a decent bit faster than the other AMD GPUs. As we've come to expect by now though, performance does drop by 10% when using PCIe 3.0, putting it just above the 5500 XT 8GB. And then we have Red Dead Redemption 2 with yet more lackluster performance. And here the 6500 XT delivers the same average frame rate as the 1650 Super and the 5500 XT 4GB, which are both two cards that launched for less money over 2 years ago. And of course, PCIe 3.0 just makes things worse, this time by 15% on average, with performance now equal to the RX 570. It's also more of the same in Resident Evil Village, where the RX 580 is actually faster than the 6500 XT out of the gate, with performance also on par with the 1650 Super. Tested with PCIe 3, however, performance drops to below even the GTX 1060, and it really isn't much ahead of the GTX 1650. Likewise, for our penultimate game test, we have Total War Saga Troy. It's not too bad on the first glance. The the 6500 XT is still slower than the 1650 Super, but it's averaging just under 60 FPS, which will get you by. Testing with PCIe 3.0, however, lops off about 17% of the performance, at which point you are once more better off with the GTX 1060, while an RX 570 also delivers the same performance. And then lastly, we're going to finish up the benchmarks with Watch Dogs Legion, and it will come as a surprise to nobody that the 6500 XT is delivering disappointing results. At best, it's still slower than the GTX 1650 Super by a couple of frames, but at worst, when using PCIe 3, it's slower than the RX 580 and just as fast as a 5500 XT 4GB. That's going to do it for all of the individual game benchmarks then, and just before we come on to the overall average performance, I just want to take a closer look at the key differences between testing on PCIe 4.0 and testing on PCIe 3.0. And in this chart we can see exactly that. This is showing us relative performance when tested with PCIe 3.0 versus PCIe 4.0. With the exception of Hitman 3, where there's basically no difference, using the 6500 XT on a PCIe 3.0 platform is really going to impact performance, and I cannot stress this enough. The worst case scenario was Forza Horizon 5, where we lost 36% performance on PCIe 3.0 compared to PCIe Gen 4, but 10 of the 12 games we tested saw double-digit performance decreases on PCIe Gen 3. As to how that affects overall average performance then, well, even on PCIe 4.0, the 6500 XT is slower than the GTX 1650 Super and barely any better than the RX 5500 XT 4GB. It's also just 4% faster than the RX 580, and bear in mind that card launched in 2017 as effectively a re-released RX 480 from 2016. And then when we look at the PCIe 3.0 data, you would be genuinely better off with the GTX 1060 instead of the 6500 XT, and honestly I'd also rather get an RX 570 as it more often than not provided more stable 1% lows. It is just absolutely dreadful viewing for AMD's latest GPU. Just before moving on from our gaming performance, I do also want to quickly touch on ray tracing, as the 6500 XT does have 16 ray accelerators. However, in the 3 games I tested, even with the lowest possible ray tracing settings, we could not get a playable frame rate from this card at 1080p. I think the fact that AMD's ray tracing isn't great to begin with doesn't help, but also ray tracing is very heavy on VRAM usage, and it absolutely pushes the 6500 XT over the edge. To get ray tracing working at a decent frame rate, you need to drop down so many other settings, it would just become a pointless exercise. Moving away from game performance for now though, here we'll take a quick look at the Gigabyte Eagle model I have used for all of my testing today. It's honestly a very dinky dual fan model which I quite like. It measures in at just 192mm long, and it's a standard dual slot thickness. It's using the same grey shroud design as we've seen on other Eagle products, but there's no backplate here, which honestly is understandable. Power is delivered by a single 6-pin, while video outputs consist of just one HDMI 2.1 port and one DisplayPort 1.4a. In our testing of this card then, under load we observed very high sustained clocks from the Eagle, with excellent overall stability. In fact, over our 30-minute stress test, it averaged a frequency of 2878 MHz, which we have to say is very impressive stuff. The Eagle's cooler as well is more than capable of dealing with the RX 6500 XT GPU, as we saw a GPU temperature of just 60 degrees with a hot spot of 80 degrees. That was also while keeping fan noise very, very low indeed at just 33 decibels, making it, for all intents and purposes, practically inaudible. As for graphics card power draw then, here we use NVIDIA PCAT to test power draw of just the card itself, so this is not total system power draw. At 1080p then, average power draw for this card hit just 96 watts, which is essentially the same as the GTX 1650 Super and GTX 1060, though do bear in mind there won't be any 6500 XT models which are entirely bus powered. They will all have a 6-pin connector. Even with that said, you might think such low power draw bodes well for efficiency, but actually the 6500 XT is no more efficient than other GPUs of this class which are over 2 years old. The 1650 Super, for instance, still provides better performance per watt at 1080p. The 6500 XT is, yes, a bit more efficient than the 5500 XT 8GB, but only by around 14%, which honestly is not amazing. Just before we wrap up this video then, I did also try my hand at some manual overclocking, but honestly there's not a whole lot to say here. AMD's actually capped the GPU frequency slider at 2975 MHz, while the memory slider is capped at 2400 MHz, both of which I could max out with no instability. That overclock then saw average GPU clock speeds increase to 2957 MHz, but honestly, apart from Hitman 3, the real world benefit to this extra clock speed really wasn't that noticeable. I think the PCIe bandwidth, memory speeds and VRAM capacity will have a far greater effect on your frame rate than what can be gained with a simple overclock. That brings us to the end of the video then, which frankly I imagine will come as a relief to many of you. All I can really say is how bitterly disappointed I am with what AMD has delivered. In fact, it is actually insulting that they have brought this to the market, considering it is actually worse than what they offered 2 years ago at the same price point. In fact, I can go one better. This product is worse than what AMD offered at the same price point in 2016, so let that sink in. It's clear to me that the 6500 XT just has several fundamental issues which completely cripple the performance. I actually think that the GPU itself, so just the processing unit with 1024 stream processors and the super high clock speeds, I actually think that is okay. It's by no means good or a step forward, but it's okay. It's just been absolutely gimped by several other things. That includes the 4GB VRAM, which is just unacceptable in 2022. The fact it's only got a 64-bit memory interface, and of course, the PCIe by 4 interface. That by 4 interface is actually such a problem, we saw on average a 17% performance degradation when testing it with PCIe 3.0. And when you consider that the vast majority of people who are going to be looking at a card in this class are more than likely to be on a PCIe 3.0 platform, it really just is a slap in the face. At that point, you're honestly going to get better performance from a GTX 1060 from 2016, and in fact in most cases I would rather have an RX 570 than the 6500 XT on PCIe 3.0, as in my testing more often than not it gave more stable 1% lows. It really is just an absolute shocking state of affairs. The thing is, those issues are all linked as well, so if this card actually had 8GB of VRAM, it wouldn't be having to offload as much data back and forth across the PCIe interface, which is what hurts performance considering the limited bandwidth. And yet AMD is somehow trying to tell us that 4GB is optimal for this card. I mean, that is utter nonsense, especially from the same company which itself said in June 2020 that 4GB of VRAM is evidently not enough for today's games. It really is just insulting that this is what they are offering in 2022, and that's even without mentioning the fact there's just 2 display connectors, there's no H.264 or H.265 encode, and no AV1 decode. This is just insulting, and frankly it's unacceptable. All I can really say to finish then is just don't buy this graphics card. If you know anyone thinking about buying it, tell them not to. Honestly, at the expected street prices I have seen for the 6500 XT, you are going to be getting a better product at a better price if you buy AMD's 6-year-old RX 480 second hand. And just how tragic is that? That is where I'm going to leave this video though, guys. If you liked it, please do toss me a thumbs up and let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Subscribe and ding that bell if you haven't already so you don't miss out on any of our videos. And come chat with us on our Discord server, which is linked in the description. While you're there, you can also find links to our merch store, and you could even consider backing us on Patreon, where you can see some of our videos early and get access to exclusive giveaways. That's it for this one though, guys. I'm Dominic for Kit Guru. I'll see you in the next one.